What do you do when your brand new truck is suddenly banned across 24 states? It wasn't a crash or a defect. It was a bureaucratic move that took thousands of owners by surprise. One day, your truck's legal, and the next, it's considered non-compliant. How did a simple purchase turn into a nightmare? The answer lies not in laws, but in policy decisions made in the shadows. Within days, these trucks went from being reliable rides to liabilities, with registrations revoked and values plummeting. But who's behind this, and why were so many people caught off guard? What's happening? It started with a push notification. Then came the DMV emails, the revoked registrations, and the flat-out refusals to renew tags. Within 48 hours, the BYD Shark 6 hybrid pickup truck was effectively banned across 24 U.S. states. No recall, no court ruling, no vote. Just a blunt policy change that struck owners like a bolt of lightning. In cities and rural counties alike, Shark 6 drivers woke up to find their trucks labeled non-compliant and unfit for road use. Some were stopped on their way to work. Others found their insurance policies canceled with no warning. The bans didn't come from Congress or even state legislatures. They arrived via administrative rulemaking buried deep in transportation departments few had ever heard of. The Shark 6 wasn't some janky prototype. It had passed emissions and crash tests abroad. It was already popular in Australia and Mexico. Here in the US, its rise was quiet but steady, a well-priced plug-in hybrid with futuristic features, respectable towing capacity, and sharp design. For many buyers, it was a relief, a break from the bloated $70,000 trucks on American roads. But now, it was radioactive. What caught owners off guard wasn't the ban itself, it was the speed and coordination. And as they scrambled to understand what had just happened, the accusations started flying. And that's when the real outrage began, one citation at a time. If this has already hit your state, or if you've had to fight just to keep your truck legal, drop a comment below. Your story matters more than ever. And if you're just learning how deep this goes, hit like so we can get this to more people before it's too late. They called me unsafe for owning it. I didn't modify it. I didn't touch a thing. And now I'm a liability on the road? That was the reaction of one Shark 6 owner in Pennsylvania who received a citation while pulling into his own driveway. The ticket wasn't for speeding or reckless driving. It was for operating a vehicle deemed ineligible for continued registration under revised compliance guidance. That phrase, bland and bureaucratic, hid a brutal truth. Thousands of everyday Americans were being penalized, not for breaking the law, but for buying a vehicle that had become politically toxic overnight. Stories poured in. A landscaper in North Carolina found his Shark towed while parked legally on the street. A family in Utah was denied registration renewal even after submitting all required paperwork. The message was clear. Owning this truck now made you a risk. Insurance companies began voiding policies without explanation. Some finance companies issued warnings about non-conforming asset depreciation. In plainer terms, the truck you bought last year for $53,000 might now be worth less than a tenth of that, if you could even sell it. These weren't fringe imports. BYD had sold over 11,000 units nationally since the start of the year. But the backlash wasn't about numbers, it was about narrative. And the narrative was starting to take shape in a place few Americans had ever heard of. Because when we followed the policy trail, we didn't find a law, we found a memo. The ban that didn't need a law. The bans didn't come from the White House. They didn't come from governors. They came from the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. Most Americans have never heard of it. But this nonprofit group, made up of DMV officials from all 50 states, quietly sets the best practices that determine what gets on the road and what doesn't. In early spring, the AAMVA issued a non-binding guidance bulletin that labeled several foreign hybrid trucks, including the BYD Shark 6, as vehicles of non-conforming classification. That term triggered a cascade. Within weeks, states began revoking registrations and freezing renewals using that exact language, even though no new legislation had been passed. The bulletin cited incomplete federal certification, even though BYD claimed full compliance with emissions and safety standards for plug-in hybrids under existing federal frameworks. It didn't matter. AAMVA's suggestion was all many state agencies needed. After all, these departments weren't equipped to argue with national advisory bodies, and the guidance didn't need to be a law to be enforced. It only needed to be interpreted as a risk management standard. In effect, a handful of bureaucrats armed with a vague document managed to shut down an entire class of vehicles, without oversight, without accountability, and without a single vote. But who wrote that document? And why did it target this truck so specifically? Safety was the excuse. Protectionism was the plan. It didn't take long to find fingerprints. Embedded in the metadata of the AAMVA bulletin were references to internal correspondence with senior policy staff from two of America's biggest automakers. According to leaked emails, the Shark 6 was described as an erosion threat to mid-tier market dominance. In other words, it was too good, too affordable, too disruptive. At a time when U.S. manufacturers were struggling to keep up with EV demand, the BYD Shark 6 presented a competitive model with a lower price, faster rollout, and better hybrid range than anything in its segment. The threat wasn't safety. The threat was that it worked. What followed was classic regulatory capture. Lobbyists from Detroit sat in on closed-door safety working groups. Policy language started shifting, talking points leaked, and then the bans. The whole machine moved faster than any public process ever could, because it wasn't public. Meanwhile, BYD had done what any smart manufacturer would do: offered a product that blended clean energy, practical features, and competitive pricing. But for legacy automakers who depend on high-margin trucks to balance bloated EV divisions, the Shark 6 wasn't a competitor. It was an existential threat. Killing it with policy was far easier than competing with it in the market. And now, that strategy was beginning to backfire, because the people they blindsided, they weren't staying quiet. The day the value dropped to zero. The moment the BYD Shark 6 was officially banned in 24 states, its resale market flatlined, listings vanished, dealerships pulled ads, private sales fell through mid-transaction. One owner in Colorado described it plainly: "I watched a $53,000 truck become a driveway sculpture overnight. No wreck, no breakdown, just a bureaucratic reclassification that obliterated its value." Insurance companies followed quickly. Some canceled policies outright. Others doubled premiums or added obscure disclaimers. In Georgia, one driver received a mid-policy notice that his coverage would be void in the event of public roadway usage. Lenders weren't far behind. With resale value near zero, Shark 6 loans were now high-risk liabilities. Repossessions began not for missed payments, but for asset devaluation. Used car dealers reported losses in the hundreds of thousands. A small business in Oregon had 5 Sharks on its lot, all unsellable by the end of the week. "We went from having a competitive edge to holding toxic inventory," the owner said. Across the country, resale values on the BYD Shark 6 plunged below scrap metal prices. The message sent to consumers was devastating. No matter how well it runs, a vehicle can be erased financially with a pen stroke, and that pen wasn't even held by a lawmaker. But the people who most wanted it erased, they were nowhere near a DMV. Detroit didn't build it, but they buried it. It wasn't coincidence. Internal documents obtained by an industry watchdog revealed that the 3 largest U.S. automakers, General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis, had been tracking the BYD Shark 6 for over 2 years. A confidential 2023 market assessment labeled it a market destabilizer due to its hybrid range, price point, and rapid production cycle. The warning was simple: unmitigated entry will trigger margin compression across core truck platforms. The Big Three's solution wasn't to innovate, it was to suffocate. Executives lobbied state regulators behind closed doors, pushing language that flagged the Shark 6 as non-compliant based on criteria most vehicles were never tested against. According to a leaked call summary, one Detroit lobbyist told a New Hampshire official, "We're not asking you to ban it, just to slow it down." But slowing down, in this context, meant redefining compliance itself. By targeting non-federally certified hybrid imports as a class, the domestic giants created a pretext. The AAMVA bulletin, once viewed as a dry policy advisory, began to resemble a playbook. State regulators acted swiftly. Meanwhile, Detroit ramped up press campaigns warning of unvetted foreign vehicles. This wasn't about safety. It was a defensive strike from a legacy industry terrified of disruption. And it worked. The competition didn't crash in a test. It was buried under paperwork. But soon the political world saw an opportunity of its own. How this became a campaign weapon overnight. It started in Michigan. A state senator, facing a tight re-election battle, declared that the Shark 6 ban was proof that foreign junk had no place on American roads. His soundbite made headlines. Within 48 hours, candidates from Texas to Ohio had joined in, accusing foreign interference in the auto industry and blaming the bans on either federal overreach or lax import enforcement, depending on the crowd. But most of them knew better. The Shark 6 met existing EPA and NHTSA standards. Its downfall wasn't regulatory, it was political theater. In battleground states where auto jobs meant votes, the bans became a wedge issue. Pro-manufacturing candidates praised them. Pro-consumer challengers condemned them. Everyone, it seemed, was using the controversy to score points. On the campaign trail, the facts blurred. Some candidates said the Shark was unsafe. Others claimed it was Chinese spyware on wheels. Neither claim was true. But the truth was never the point. The Shark 6 had become a symbol, a proxy war for who gets to define American when it comes to industry and identity. Political consultants pounced. Targeted ads ran in suburban swing districts. Populist rallies featured damaged sharks as backdrops. What had begun as a ban was now a brand, one wrapped in nationalism, fear, and carefully calibrated outrage. And right as it peaked, the federal government finally stepped in. Then Washington got involved. On a quiet Tuesday morning, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration announced a formal inquiry into the Shark 6 bans. The press release was brief, clinical, and unassuming, but the implications were seismic. At the heart of the investigation, whether state-level regulators had overstepped their bounds by enacting what amounted to de facto vehicle bans without legislative action or federal coordination. The NHTSA probe didn't just target the states, it zeroed in on the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators and their relationships with domestic automakers. Subpoenas followed, staff were questioned, communication logs were requested. What emerged was a tangled web of informal calls, drafts circulated in Google Docs, and sudden revisions to compliance checklists. For the first time, federal and state authorities were clashing over jurisdiction, not about road safety, but over who had the right to define what was legal to drive in America. Some states pushed back. Florida officials called the inquiry politically motivated. California regulators dug in, but others blinked. Minnesota froze its enforcement. New Jersey reversed course entirely. In Congress, oversight hearings loomed. Lawmakers from both parties demanded transparency. For Shark 6 owners, the bans had already done the damage, but now the battle had moved from personal loss to public showdown, because what started as a shutdown had become a reckoning. China's most dangerous export wasn't the truck, it was the model. The BYD Shark 6 wasn't just a pickup, it was a strategy on wheels, built as a plug-in hybrid with torque-rich acceleration and a rugged utility frame. The Shark 6 was designed for two markets at once: consumers who wanted reliable performance and governments who demanded electrification. Priced well below American electric trucks and produced in record time, the Shark wasn't just a product, it was a warning shot. In Beijing, BYD's engineers weren't trying to mimic Detroit's giants. They were leapfrogging them. The Shark 6 was one piece of a broader campaign to corner the global EV and hybrid pickup segment before Western automakers even recognized it existed. Every component, from the modular battery chassis to the regenerative four-wheel braking, was built for replication. BYD's internal memos revealed the goal clearly: flood the mid-size utility market before U.S. manufacturers could retool. What threatened America most wasn't the truck, it was the template. A low-cost, fast-cycle hybrid vehicle designed not to meet regulations, but to rewrite them. While U.S. brands fought each other over full-size EV trucks, still in prototype, BYD was already selling and shipping. But when the gates to the U.S. market slammed shut, BYD didn't stop. It just changed direction. They moved the factory south of the border. As bans spread across 24 U.S. states, BYD made a move that surprised no one in the trade world, but shocked the public. They announced the construction of a full-scale manufacturing plant in northern Mexico. The location? Just over the Texas border, directly in range of North American logistics networks. Within 6 months, construction was underway. Within 12, the first chassis rolled off the line. Under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, vehicles assembled in Mexico with sufficient regional content qualified for tariff-free import to the U.S. BYD's hybrid pickups would now legally enter the country, sidestepping the very restrictions that had been designed to keep them out. Instead of fighting the bans, they rerouted around them. The play was tactical brilliance. BYD didn't need to fight lawmakers, they just needed to follow the rules better than anyone else. By hiring local labor, sourcing regional parts, and meeting USMCA origin thresholds, they could rebuild their access from inside the system. Suddenly, the Shark 6 was a North American vehicle, not a Chinese import. American officials found themselves trapped. Any move to block these vehicles now risked trade war consequences. The border plant didn't just save the truck, it made it politically radioactive to oppose. And while trade lawyers argued over eligibility, jobs were vanishing back home. Ohio just lost its last gear plant. In Youngstown, Ohio, the lights at Ellison Drive Components went out quietly. The factory had operated for over 4 decades, supplying gearboxes and torque-to hubs to mid-market automakers. But after multiple contract cancellations in the spring of 2025, linked directly to the Shark 6 bans, Ellison was finished. Their story wasn't unique. Across Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, part suppliers who had diversified into BYD's supply chain found themselves suddenly stranded. Without clarity on legality or long-term access to the U.S. market, buyers canceled orders. Assembly delays followed. In many cases, suppliers didn't even hear from clients. They read the updates in trade journals. One plant manager in Toledo described the shock. "We spent 2 years gearing up for hybrid torque converters. Then the bans hit. We never even got to full production." Layoffs swept through small towns. The local economic ecosystem built around just-in-time manufacturing simply couldn't absorb the shock. While headlines focused on showroom politics, the real bleeding happened on factory floors. American suppliers had tried to participate in the next wave of vehicle innovation, only to be left behind. When regulation turned unpredictable, contracts vanished, confidence collapsed. And then came the real twist. It wasn't just happening in the Midwest anymore. Red states, blue trucks, and green incentives. As Washington sparred and northern factories shuttered, something unexpected happened in the South. Governors in states like Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee, often aligned with federal deregulatory rhetoric, began quietly courting BYD. The reason was simple: jobs. Mississippi offered tax holidays. Arkansas waived site permits. Louisiana proposed direct subsidies per vehicle assembled. While national conversations still labeled the Shark 6 a Chinese threat, state-level economic agencies saw a different picture: a proven product, a workforce ready to build, and billions in infrastructure at stake. In Georgia, one legislator remarked, "You can't say no to 5,000 union-proof jobs just because the truck's not red, white, and blue." Political realignment followed. Republican lawmakers who once condemned Chinese manufacturing now framed their support as free market pragmatism. Local mayors highlighted the environmental upsides. The irony was staggering: blue trucks built in red states, funded by green incentives. Suddenly, the old political lines blurred. Federal Democrats who once supported EFI subsidies now hesitated, worried about domestic blowback. Southern conservatives who once scoffed at foreign investment embraced it as economic salvation. What emerged was a new alliance, states acting in their own economic self-interest, sidestepping Washington gridlock. In the backlash to a ban, a borderless automotive future was taking root, and that future would no longer wait for permission. Detroit stalled while Shenzhen scaled. While American car companies debated how to reinvent the pickup for an electric era, their rivals in Shenzhen skipped the debate and got to work. The BYD Shark 6 didn't just emerge overnight. It was the result of a years-long strategy built around iteration and speed. BYD's engineers worked in cycles measured in weeks. Detroit's teams waited on memos, quarterly meetings, and, most of all, government protection. Ford postponed its mid-size hybrid truck project 3 separate times. General Motors shifted investment from pickup electrification to luxury SUV segments. betting that subsidies and legacy brand loyalty would shield their margins. Meanwhile, BYD launched, revised, and expanded its Shark lineup across 3 continents. The domestic auto industry didn't fail because it lacked the tools. It failed because it trusted the system to hold the line against disruption. Executives banked on tariffs, import restrictions, and regulatory barriers. What they did not prepare for was a foreign manufacturer that could move faster, cheaper, and smarter. The Shark 6 caught Detroit flat-footed. While engineers waited for green lights, policymakers were busy drawing red lines. By the time the ban was enacted, it was already too late. BYD had built a global supply chain, a regional factory, and a loyal customer base. And as Congress entered the arena, things only got more combative. Congress calls it a national security threat. The moment BYD's plant in Mexico began exporting to American distributors under USMCA, Capitol Hill erupted. Lawmakers, already under pressure from domestic manufacturers and national security think tanks, seized on the moment to reframe the Shark 6 not just as a market disruptor, but a Trojan horse. Senator Maria Franklin of Illinois stood at a podium flanked by military officials and warned of embedded firmware vulnerabilities. Congressman Dale Norton from Texas proposed an emergency rider banning the registration of all Chinese-made electric vehicles, citing strategic infrastructure infiltration. The hearing used phrases like digital sovereignty, vehicle espionage, and critical dependency. None of the allegations came with hard proof, but they didn't need to. The pivot from economic panic to national security narrative was swift. It allowed political actors to unify bipartisan support against a single foreign target. Suddenly, this wasn't about price, performance, or consumer choice. It was about sovereignty. The legislation, titled the Clean Roads Act, advanced quickly. If passed, it would require federal certification for all electric vehicles with foreign core components. Critics warned it would devastate competition and increase prices. Proponents claimed it was essential protection. But while lawmakers pushed through fear-driven bills, another firestorm was building within their own voter base. Because what Congress called a threat, workers had already started calling a paycheck. Union leaders want a ban, workers don't. Inside the United Auto Workers regional halls, the divide was visible. National leadership condemned the Shark 6 and endorsed federal legislation to block all Chinese-branded electric vehicles from entering the market. But at the local level, on factory floors, in welding shops, and among assembly crews, the mood was more complicated. In Tennessee and Alabama, newly built BYD-affiliated plants began hiring thousands of workers, many of whom had previously been laid off by legacy brands. These weren't contract gigs or warehouse filler jobs. They were skilled positions, offering competitive wages and upward mobility. And they didn't require relocating to Michigan. Union organizers found themselves walking a tightrope. On one hand, they had to protect collective bargaining power and preserve legacy partnerships. On the other, they couldn't ignore the new jobs feeding families in communities that hadn't seen auto investment in decades. "I lost my job with Chrysler," one worker said outside a new parts facility in Macon, Georgia. "Then I got hired building Shark drivetrain parts. What's un-American about working again?" The union's leadership pushed back, accusing BYD of manufacturing division alongside vehicles. But in reality, the division was already here, between a protectionist past and a globalized future. And as union halls debated ideology, consumers were already feeling the sting in their wallets. This isn't just about one truck. It's about every choice they want to make for you, without you. If you want to stay ahead of the next shutdown, hit subscribe, because the next ban won't come with a warning either. Your EV just got more expensive. Again, when the first round of restrictions took hold, electric vehicle prices jumped modestly. By the third wave of regulatory blocks, the increase was undeniable. Consumers shopping for plug-in hybrids or compact EV trucks found sticker prices that had leaped by over 20% in less than 1 year. Entry-level models from domestic brands vanished from showrooms. Mid-tier options were delayed due to missing battery components, many of which had been sourced from suppliers affiliated with BYD or similar foreign firms. Dealers pointed fingers at Washington. Automakers blamed supply chains. Buyers blamed all of them. Worse still, federal incentives designed to ease EV adoption now came with caveats. Vehicles had to be manufactured and sourced from approved regions, using verified material origins. That meant many hybrids that were once eligible for tax credits suddenly didn't qualify. A $25,000 truck became a $35,000 burden overnight. For working-class buyers, the dream of clean, affordable mobility was slipping out of reach. For middle-class families already juggling inflation, it felt like punishment. The BYD ban did more than restrict a foreign brand. It triggered a cascade of costs, logistical, political, and financial, that every driver now had to absorb. And when the dust settled, only one question remained: who was the road really for? This ban didn't just target a truck, it targeted choice, affordability, and the right to drive something different. If you've been affected, or if you're worried your state is next, speak up in the comments. Your voice adds pressure where it counts. And if this opened your eyes to how deep the system goes, hit like to push this message further. We're not done digging. New bans, new loopholes, and new consequences are unfolding fast. Subscribe now so you're not blindsided again, because the next wave won't ask for your permission. It'll just hit, and you'll want to be ready.